Reading is a wonderful way to relax, escape into a new world or learn new realities. We're still celebrating National Book Week, and eNCA senior researcher Angelo Fick joins us in studio to discuss this topic. Angelo, always good to have you with us. I think perhaps what our viewers are not aware of is the avalanche of books that you come into the office with every day. And very many people who watch you and listen to your analysis probably wonder how you came to be where you are today. So I'm going to ask you from a personal point of view, how books have changed your life.
Well, I think many of us are alive because of books, because they're a way of understanding the world you're in, your place in it, but also to open up your imagination to the other possibilities that are available to you that are not immediately presented to you by your world. I was lucky enough to grow up in a house in which both my parents were readers, so even when they weren't particularly rich, in fact they were very poor at many points in their lives, books were constitutive of the life that we lived. And I think I came to reading early because I was a child born late into my parents' life. So I grew up with adult conversations and books everywhere. And to me, reading is partly a kind of natural thing that young children do. Before they even begin to read books, they're reading their world, they're trying to understand it. And so making sense of it is something that I think those of us who've had the privilege of having children in our lives and having to take care of them know from a small child's perspective, reading the world to figure out your place in it and how it responds to you is the first moment of kind of learning to read. And as an adult, if you want to go back to that moment, it can be a greatly empowering moment to reimagine that moment of being the reader, of confronting yourself with somebody else's imagination, somebody else's view of the world, and quietly listening to it before you begin to do what Toni Morrison calls the dance of the mind, which is to engage your mind with the words on the page, which is this other person's mind in representation.
Let's talk about that a little bit more, because we're very limited to our own reality in many ways. How does reading, particularly reading about people in different places, in different situations to ours, with different genders to us, different races to us, different backgrounds to us, how does reading about these people expand our worldview of their lives?
Well, firstly, it engenders empathy, so it allows you to begin to understand a completely different person's point of view. And in a country like South Africa, which Bessie Head once called a country of so many signs and divisions that you end up with no people at all, it's important for us to start thinking across the boundaries rather than to retreat into new boundaries. So we've displaced the old boundaries of apartheid and colonialism, but we now then run the risk of inventing new categories in which we think of ourselves as being with people who are like us. And reading allows us to explode those lines and to ask ourselves, what is it that we have in common with people who at first sight appear to be very different from us? Recognition is very important in reading, because often we have feelings, we have understandings, we have troubles, we have questions, and until a very good writer articulates it in prose or in poetry or in drama and we see it and recognize it, that moment of recognition tells us we are not alone. So while reading is a very solitary activity that requires time and retreat from the world, it's a way in which to recharge one's batteries and re-engage the world slightly more empowered, because you now are no longer quite so alone. And you know, the human condition is a lonely condition because we all live in our own heads to a certain extent, but it's also a communal condition because the problems that we face are not unique to us, that there are often problems others have faced in history, others are facing elsewhere in the world, and in opening ourselves up to that world, as Ngugi wa Thiong'o said when he came to South Africa to give his talk, we become better equipped to deal with the world and to make sense of it. And for children, I think this is a very, very crucial lesson, that we don't just read the stuff that that are familiar or that reinforce what we already know, that we challenge ourselves all the time to read things that are very much outside of our own experience. To read of the experience of slavery is to begin to try and understand what slavery meant, even though you will never be a slave or you aren't a slave. And the same for reading about the lives of people who lived long before you did, or live in an alternative imagined reality that doesn't exist. It allows you to make sense of your world slightly in a more empowered way.
You've led me to a question I did want to ask you about the value of fiction, because particularly in our realm, which is news, we tend to consume a great deal of documentary type reading, a lot of literature that is fact-based. What is the value of reading fiction?
I think the value of reading fiction is that it is the space in which the best storytellers that we've produced as a species have, emerged and in which they told their stories. And storytelling is basically how we survive. Margaret Atwood talks about how reading came about because we needed to look at signs in the environment we lived in, and if there were dangerous animals in the river over there, telling the story was important, but also knowing the signs that showed a crocodile had come out of the water and was going back in. It would allow you to survive. And so reading for me is always about not just that active imagination, but the ability to tell a story. Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy is for me the best novel ever written. Written in a language I don't necessarily read in, but because of the gift of translation I can get access to this great story about love, but also about politics, about a country in crisis, and about a couple trying to find love between one another. And it's that that teaches empathy, and it's important for us to become better storytellers, to read texts that demonstrate that empathy, where the writer has gotten into a character who is not the writer, him or herself. A man writing about a woman's life, a woman writing about another man's life. These are, I think, exercises very important for us to begin to relate to one another more empathetically, with greater understanding, and with great not just personal benefits to ourselves as individuals, but political effects for the societies we live in.
Angelo Fick, you've encapsulated that so well. Thank you so much for talking to us this afternoon. Our senior researcher, Angelo Fick, sharing his love for books and their value with us.